Well, with those long introductions, I'll have to add that on to the end of my talk, Doug. Um, I do come by my appreciation of the Civil War quite naturally. My folks grew up in Texas, and when we would go down and visit from Chicago, my uncle, who was a pastor, would make us stand up. We're visitors, and that's how they did it in the Southern Baptist Church that he pastored. And he would introduce us as his Yankee relatives, like putting a target on somebody, right? But I grew up in the Chicago area. I was adopted by my parents, and I was adopted through an agency started as a result of some baby being dropped off at Moody Bible Institute, Evangelical Child and Family Agency. They wanted to found an agency that would find Christian homes for babies that were without. And so that's where that started, and I was about the 102nd baby that was adopted through that agency. And so that was a connection to Moody Bible Institute. I went to Moody as a student after high school, and found out, well, even early on as a kid, that I really loved the Civil War. That was my first book. Anyone have that one? The How and Why of the Civil War. I got it through the school book sale, and really loved that. And then my friend Dan Lundquist in 4th grade gave me the best photos of the Civil War. And photos for me just make it all come to life. I've collected a lot of books. If you'd like to purchase some, I no, but photos make it real, you know, and so I've always appreciated photos. And so my love for the Civil War came naturally. I didn't find out until much later that my great-great-grandfather fought for the 119th Illinois Regiment after having left Virginia, where he grew up, and moved somehow. We don't know the story behind that, but he ended up in Illinois, fought for the Union as his brother fought for the 21st Virginia with Stonewall Jackson. So the brother versus brother idea really did exist during the Civil War. D.L. Moody. Oh, sorry. He grew up in Massachusetts. He was born February 5th, 1837, to Edwin and Betsy Moody. Edwin was a mason, but one of his issues was he was fond of the drink. And so that interfered with his work, it interfered with his health. And Dwight Moody was the 7th child born to the family. And the dad died when Moody was 4 years old. Mom was pregnant with twins. And so when he passed, they were in dire straits. The money, they were already in debt, and the debtors came to collect. They weren't allowed to take the house, but they took everything else, including the firewood in the shed. And if it wasn't for Mrs. Moody's brother and a pastor at a nearby church that was very kind and helpful, the family would certainly have been broken up. I've always considered doing a talk also on D.L. Moody and the contrast and similarities between him and Robert Shaw. Robert Shaw of the 54th Massachusetts, and their families were about 70, 80 miles apart. They were born within months of one another. And the contrast in economic and educational childhoods was quite different, but they ended up doing similar types of work, where Shaw worked to free slaves through service and through leading them into battle. Moody worked to free souls. Moody's schooling was sporadic. He had what amounted to about a 3rd or 4th grade education, and it was broken up by the need to work. At 10 years old, his mother sort of leased he and his brother out to a farm 15, 16 miles away, and so it wasn't practical to go back and forth, and so they left home. Dwight was 10 years old and worked on a farm, helping out a farmer there. And he tells a story of them walking in a February morning away from home and looking back down into the valley where the house was and just sitting down and weeping at their fate. But he learned to work hard. He worked on farms. He helped deliver newspapers. He cut and hauled wood. And by the age of 17, he was tired of it all already. And he said, I'm going to the big city to make my fortune. And at 17, he left home. And he headed for Boston. He did have family in Boston. A couple of his mother's brothers lived in Boston. But he was too proud to ask them for help until after a few days of living off the street and having nothing to eat, he swallowed his pride and went to see one of the uncles. And the uncle said, well, your Uncle Samuel has a shoe store, and if you ask him, he'll let you work there. And for 3 days, he wouldn't ask him. Just that pride got in the way. He wanted to make his own way, didn't want to ask for help, but he finally gave in. And his uncle kind of knew him pretty well. And he said, if you come here and if I let you work here, you're going to want to run the place before a month is over. So if you come, you're going to have to listen to me. You're going to have to do it my way, and you have to go to church. Those were his parameters for the job. And Moody said, I'll do it, and I'll work hard. And before long, he was the best salesman in the shop. This was put together by one of my former students at Kenosha Bible Church, Eric Germanaro, put that together for me. But because there were no examples of him working in the shoe store. But he became very successful working in the shoe store. In fact, before long, they opened up a branch, and he became the manager. And he did what he promised both his mother and his uncle, and that's that he went to church. And he didn't understand it all based on his education, but he appreciated more than anything the Sunday school that they had and the teacher that he had, and his name was Edward Kimball. And Mr. Kimball took a liking to Moody and tried to do his best in teaching him how to study the Bible and understand the Bible. And one day, Mr. Kimball was walking past the store where Moody worked and just felt an urging to go in and talk to him about his faith. And he walked past the store. He got scared. He wasn't sure of himself going in there and talking to him. He didn't want to interrupt the business and those sorts of things. But he finally went in. And when he went in, Moody was working in the back room, and that kind of worked out well. And so he went in and talked to him about his faith and that the Lord loved him, wanted to be a part of his life, and if he would just give his life over to the Lord, his sins would be forgiven, and he'd have a place in heaven, and he'd have the Lord with him on a daily basis. And that's exactly what he did. And it began to change his life in a number of ways. And he was pretty foul-mouthed and loved to get in trouble in some ways that way. And in a lot of ways, he was on his own at 17 and 18 years old. There wasn't any parent overseeing his every move, but he felt guilty about some of those things and began to change his life. And in fact, before long, he rented a pew in the church and began to fill it up, inviting other people to come alongside. He also joined the YMCA. And at the YMCA, they had $1 for a year to enter. Is that the same here, the YMCA? I know different. But you get all the books that you wanted to read for free. They would occasionally have meals. But most importantly, they had lecture series. And he was able to hear the likes of Oliver Wendell Holmes and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and some of the theologians and thinkers of the day. And as I read a book about Robert Shaw, he had those same people in his home because his parents were well-to-do in politics, and they had some of the same kinds of influences. He had a brush with the law in Boston. He joined an abolitionist riot there was a pending extradition of a fugitive slave named Anthony Burns, and Moody participated in an attack on the courthouse trying to free this fugitive slave. But they were chased off by armed soldiers. In fact, he had to climb the side of a building up onto the roof, jump over to another roof in order to escape being captured. But he had a taste of what the abolition movement was like at a young age. Moody continued to grow in his career, and after being a branch manager at his uncle's place, they came to a loggerheads. They found that they didn't see or have the same philosophies of business. And Moody was certainly hungry to accumulate lots of money, and so he decided his best move would be to go to Chicago. Chicago was an up-and-coming city. It was growing very quickly. Lots of business was to be had, and so he got $5 from his uncle, got a ticket one way to Chicago, and arrived very similarly to how he arrived in Boston, with not a lot of money, no contacts, and spent a few weeks looking for work. But his intended goal was to be a 100,000-aire. Now, you know, a millionaire would be sort of what we would think of now, but that wasn't in their mindset at all. But his first job was at Wiswall's, two brothers who owned a shoe store, something he was very familiar with. And he did get a letter of reference from his uncle, so that was helpful in finally securing work. And he went to work right away. And he immediately made a connection with the Plymouth Congregational Church. And he hired a pew and began to fill that, and before long it was 4 pews. And lived in a boarding house with the likes of Marshall Fields, and rubbed shoulders with Cyrus McCormick and George Armour of Armour and Hammer, and became very familiar with and friends with a guy who was a mentor and a tremendous ministry partner by the name of John Farwell. He connected with the YMCA as soon as he got to Chicago. And one of the things that appealed to him both there in Boston and then in Chicago was a prayer meeting they held at noontime. And he became a leader in some of those prayer meetings. Here's a guy that's not very educated. He had a hard time reading the Bible, but he had a passion for the Lord and a passion for prayer. And the YMCA had a goal that he agreed with. And obviously they wanted to introduce people to the Lord, but they also wanted to help young single men who arrived in a western town like Chicago stay on the straight and narrow, because there were lots of vices and temptations that could swallow them up. And Moody, being one of those guys, understood it fully. And so he was out to help those young men steer straight, and he helped do that through the YMCA. But one of the things that Moody encountered when he was there in Chicago was children on the street. And there were a lot of poor kids. In fact, the area that he ministered to kids particularly was called Helltown. And these were kids that some had very little parenting, and Chicago area had gone through a recession in 57 and 58, and so there were a lot of poor families. And so he just wanted to care for those kids, and through the YMCA he found an outlet to do that, and also through his church. And so he started bringing the kids to church. Well, kids in church can be a really positive thing. In fact, I've been to church with mostly folks my age and older, and we miss having kids. And if somebody walks in a church with family and looks at all these gray hairs, you know, they kind of think there's nothing there for them. And so you need those young ones. And but he brought a lot of them. In fact, they called him Crazy Moody because he would do anything he could to bring these kids to Sunday school and church. Well, some churches can handle that. Some churches can't, especially when he starts to bring them in at 100 at a time. And so, Crazy Moody was his nickname, and he was out on the street bringing the kids any way he could. He'd offer them pony rides, he'd offer them candy, he'd offer, things that we would look on very poorly these days. But he cared about the kids, and he understood their plight. Coming from a family without a dad, without an income, and depending on other people to help you, he got that entirely. And so whenever he had free time, he was visiting kids, he was raising money to get food to them, and he would use his platform at the YMCA to have prayer for them in their prayer times. And so by 1860, he had decided to leave his job, leave his life goal of making $100,000, and devote his time to working with those families. And so he was out on the street, serving families, getting food to them, and looking for any way he could influence them into knowing the Lord. In fact, his work became so popular that his Sunday school grew. By the way, he had to leave the church that he was having his Sunday school kids come to because there were too many. And so they first used an old closed down tavern that wasn't being used and cleaned that out and made that their Sunday school. And when they outgrew that, Farwell helped them raise funds to build their own building. And they housed over 1,500 kids on a Sunday morning. And that became so popular that in 1860, November of 1860, just after Lincoln had been elected, he came to Chicago to thank all those that helped elect him, and as he was getting ready to go to the White House, and he showed up at Moody's Sunday School. Farwell had told him about what a work it was, and Lincoln came with the understanding that he would not speak. That's not why I'm coming. I don't want to spend a lot of time. I've got all these scheduled meetings, but I'll drop by. And as he got ready to say goodbye after waving and greeting the kids, Moody said, "And if Mr. Lincoln has anything to say, we would love to hear from him." And of course, then he felt obligated and basically said, "If you will listen to this man and to these teachers, you may too also become president of the United States. I did not have the advantage of these people caring for me like you have for you." And so he said a good word for Moody and for their Sunday school. This slide is supposedly of one of his first Sunday school classes. And these men, or these boys, became his sidekicks, his armed guard, not armed, but they would be with him through the neighborhoods and protect them from those who might want to disrupt his work. Some of them grew up, this was taken in like 1858. Some of them, 4, 5, 6 years later, joined the military, and much of the 72nd Regiment was made up of either people who came through Moody Sunday School or people who they helped recruit. And they even tried to get him to be their chaplain, but he said, "I still have my work in Chicago." And so he would go back and forth to the front, but he had his work in Chicago that he felt obligated to. One of the young men mentioned earlier, I didn't mention him, but his name is Jimmy Sexton, was supposedly one of the guys in this picture. Jimmy Sexton was a teenager that attended Moody Sunday School, but suddenly disappeared for a few weeks. And they noticed. Moody knew him, appreciated him, and finally, after a number of weeks of him missing the Sunday school, he went to Jimmy, his neighborhood, and found him and asked what was up. And Jimmy said his dad beat him for going to Sunday school. And so Moody said, "Okay." And he went to have a talk with Mr. Sexton. And Jimmy wasn't from a poor family, but Mr. Sexton had a similar problem that Moody's father had, and that was with the bottle. And so he had a sit-down talk with him, and the details of it aren't shared, but after that, Jimmy was able to go back to Sunday school. And he became a faithful follower of the Lord and of Moody. And when he went into the service, he was a leader. He was just born to be a leader, but he was only 18 years old. And his company elected him captain. Well, the colonel of the regiment said, there's no 18-year-old going to be a captain in my company. But the men just vouched for him. And he said, who do you know back home that I could talk to? And he said, D.L. Moody and John Farwell. Okay, he made him captain. And he later on became Postmaster General of Chicago and then head of the entire Grand Army of the Republic for a couple of years in the 1890s. That's James Sexton. Another person of influence in the 72nd was D.W. Whittle. Whittle also was from Chicago. Moody and he were friends, and they knew one another, but not real well until Whittle was wounded in a battle and brought back to Chicago, and they wanted to use him to recruit more troops in Chicago. And when that was the case, he was afraid. He didn't want to talk, and they shoved him up on stage one day and said, talk about your experience. And he was scared to death. He wasn't prepared for that, didn't know it was coming. And all of a sudden, in the crowd, somebody said, let's give 3 cheers for D.W. And it was Moody down in the front row. And he said, all I knew is somebody had my back. Right away, he knew there was somebody that was there for him. And Whittle went on to be an evangelist, just like Moody, later on in his life. When the war broke out, as many of you know who study the Civil War, there was need for places for training. And Chicago became one of those places. Camp Douglas was opened, and many soldiers came through here on their way to the front and did some training or just waiting for a place that they were going to be sent to. And Moody and the fellows from the YMCA said, this is an opportunity that we can't pass up. And so they gathered Bibles, they gathered hymnals, they gathered little tracts, and in the back there's some samples of a tract. You're welcome to take one of those for free. And literature that could be given to the soldiers. They're having a lot of downtime. Certainly they did drilling, but then they had a lot of downtime, and they were thirsty for anything they could get their hands on, newspapers from back home, books, literature. And Moody loved to be able to provide that for him. There was a funny story of when he and, I think it was Jacobs was the fellow's last name, that he went to Camp Douglas the first time. And Jacobs had a chaplain's badge and was given free rein to go into the facility. Moody had nothing. And so they came to the guard. You had to have a pass. Jacobs had a pass, Moody didn't, and they were going to turn him away. And he said, well, you know, I'm come with the auspices of the YMCA, and we're coming here to be a benefit to the soldiers. And he said, okay, I'll let you in as a chaplain, but you have to be out of here by 8 p.m. And so they went inside, and they got ready to hand out some of the literature, and somebody said, we need one of the chaplains to speak. And Jacob says to Moody, you're a chaplain now. And he made him and Jacobs writes later that it was very interesting as far, because he wasn't prepared either. But he had a heart for ministry. He had a heart for kids. Some of these kids are people who had come up through his ministry. And somebody made a remark once that they came upon Moody late one evening after he had had a children's meeting, and there was a kid who had asked some questions, and so he actually had him up in his arm, and he was trying to read his Bible to him, and he couldn't. He kept having to skip over large portions of it because he couldn't read it. And he was weeping while he was doing that, because he felt so bad he couldn't read the Bible to this child. And he began to pray. This fellow, Moody didn't know this other fellow was listening in. And he just prayed, Lord, help me to learn to teach and read to these children. And this man remarked later that what he lacked in education, he had much more in heart and spirit for these kids. And so that represented Moody, and everyone described him in that way. When the war broke out, we had the training center in Chicago. Then after the first numbers of troops went out from Camp Douglas, it was sort of empty. There were some Union troops, but after a battle and you capture some prisoners, what do you do with them? Nobody was prepared for that, nor the great amounts of wounded that were left behind. And so Camp Douglas opened up and became a prisoner of war camp for Confederate soldiers. And again, an opportunity for them to share the faith, share literature, even provide clothing, because they came in from the South, weren't ready for Chicago winters, and that was a very difficult thing for them. And so they looked for ways in which they could minister to the Confederate soldiers. That's a picture of some of the Confederate soldiers at Camp Douglas. They have some warm clothes, but not all of them did. They distributed hymnals, and there were Christians in amongst the Confederate soldiers, and they took a look at these hymnals and passed them back in. Anyone know why? There's a Union flag on the cover of that hymnal, and they would not sing from the Union hymnal. And so they had to get another cover for the hymnals before they would use them, and they did. They went and got a different cover for them, but this is a view of one of those. In 1862, Moody married Betsy Revell, and she's from the famous publisher, Revell Publishing. And so she came from a well-to-do family. He first met her in the late 1850s as a middle-aged teenager, like 14 or 15 years old when he first met her, and recruited her to help him in ministering to the kids in the slums. And she really had a heart for what he was doing. And they weren't married until 1862, but that's when they got married. Oops. These are some of the hospital arrangements that Moody would come upon. When the war broke out and things got a lot more difficult, the YMCA first organized a war committee, and Moody was heavily involved in the war committee, and the war committee was how can we help the soldiers? Moody had taken a vow not to fight. He didn't feel like he could pick up a weapon and kill someone, but that didn't mean he wasn't going to do his part. And so his part was to support the soldiers, help the wounded, help the soldiers in camp. And so he would, through the auspices of an organization that the YMCA helped start, the United States Christian Commission, go to these sites and bring supplies. And he would go for 2 or 3 weeks at a time to different places on in the Western Theater. In the back I have a sheet that has both a bibliography, some of the books that I studied from for this talk, as well as a timeline of how Moody progressed through the war and some of the places and things that he was doing. But you know, they would go to these different hospitals, and they had many different units, and sometimes it was as organized as this as they got into the war. And this one is actually in Maryland, so this isn't one that he had visited, but there were many set up similarly. Some were even on steamers. This is the City of Memphis steamer, and it was a hospital ship. And so if there was a body of water, and most often there was, not always, but most often there was, they would bring up these steamships with supplies, unload the supplies, and then bring wounded on board and either minister to them there or take them to another site where they could be helped out. In fact, Moody had his own office on the City of Memphis, so it could have been a closet for all we know, but he did have a place where he stored some things, and it's said that in his office there was a barrel, and that barrel was filled with playing cards because he traded Bibles for playing cards, trying to get those vices out of the players, the soldiers' hands, or they gambled, lost their money, couldn't send any back home. Let's get Bibles in their hands instead. And so he would trade. I'm sure he didn't always make them give up something for it, but he had a stack of playing cards in his office. Moody wrote this: "After the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing, I was in a hospital at Murfreesboro. In the middle of the night, I was aroused and told that a man in one of the wards wanted to see me. I went to see him, and he called me chaplain. I'm not a chaplain, and he said he wanted me to help him die. I said, I would take you right up in my arms and carry you into the kingdom of God if I could, but I cannot. I cannot help you die. Who can? The Lord Jesus can. He came for that purpose. He shook his head and he said, he cannot save me. I have sinned all my life. And I said, but he came to save sinners. I thought of his mother in the north, and I was sure that she was anxious that he should die in peace. So I resolved that I would stay with him. I prayed for 2 or 3 hours and repeated all the promises I could, for it was evident in a few hours he would be gone. I said I wanted to read him a conversation that Christ had with a man who was anxious about his soul. And I turned to the 3rd chapter of John. His eyes were riveted on me, and when I came to the 14th and 15th verses, the passage before us, he caught up these words. As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, so that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have eternal life. He stopped me, and he said, is that there? Yes. He asked me to read it again, and so I did. He leaned on his elbows on the cot, clasping together his hands. That's good. Won't you read it again? I read it a 3rd time, and then went on with the rest of the chapter. And when I had finished, his eyes were closed, his hands were folded, and there was a smile on his face. How it was lit up. What a change had come over it. I saw his lips quivering, and leaning over him, I heard in a faint whisper, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. His eyes opened and said, that's enough. Don't read any more. He lingered a few hours, pillowing his head on those 2 verses, and went up in one of Christ's chariots. One of the roles of the chaplains, of the agents for the U.S. Christian Commission, is printed out on the top of this postcard. U.S. Christian Commission sends this as a soldier's message to his home. Let it hasten to those who wait for tidings. So their role wasn't just preaching religion, preaching Christ. It was helping the soldiers however they could. There was a criticism about the U.S. Christian Commission in that that's all they were concerned about, and they didn't care about the person's bodily health. And I kind of compare it to people in their view of hospitals and used car salesmen. Either you swear by them or you swear at them. It's there's hardly any in between. And I'm sure there was variance in how those from the U.S. Christian Commission dealt with people. There's reports that they withheld some of the goods and services that they brought out to the field for cash. And so you have people that take advantage of people wherever you go. But one of their goals was to make sure that people back home knew of their family member being cared for and helped out. Moody participated in letter writing, which must have been difficult. I've read some of his letters. Moody Bible Institute has his letter collection, and his writing was horrible. His English was terrible. His spelling, kind of like mine. But he had just a desire to help them, and so those who couldn't write were either wounded too badly or never learned themselves. He would write on their behalf. But one of the rules of the U.S. Christian Commission was that they were to sort of steer away from certain ordinances like communion and baptism, because there's so many different denominations and religions represented. Well, Moody didn't always pay attention to that. And it was in Murfreesboro in the spring of 1862, General Rosecrans was preparing his army for Tullahoma. Moody came under the auspices of the Christian Commission. His preaching resulted in quite a revival and caused considerable excitement and great interest. General Alexander McCook, who commanded one of the corps, became much interested in the work, and there was something of a rivalry between a number of regiments as to which furnished the most recruits to Moody's Christian army. They told a story on Colonel Fred Neffler of an Indiana regiment, who was an enthusiastic admirer and defender of his regiment and did not propose to allow it to play second to any regiment from the Army of the Cumberland. One day, an officer of another regiment came over and related in the hearing of Colonel Neffler that the evening before, 20 converts from their regiment had been baptized. This made the number exceed the number of converts from Colonel Fred's regiment by some 12 or 15. The colonel immediately summoned his adjutant, and in his extremely German brogue, made more broken by the excitement from which he labored, ordered him a detail of 15 men and have them baptized without delay. Some of the things that Moody did was to carry litters of wounded soldiers off the field, or to pillow their head when they couldn't be moved and didn't know whether or not they'd make it through the night. They'd bring water, they'd bring food, they'd bring clothing. So he went through great experiences. He wrote this: "One night a party of our men found themselves on a battlefield in charge of a great many wounded soldiers, and all of a sudden the retreat of the army, they were left wholly without shelter or supplies. Having done their best for the poor fellows, bringing them water from a distant brook and searching for haversacks of the dead for rations, they began to say for themselves to one another, 'These weak and wounded men must have food or they will die. The army is out of reach and there's no village for many miles. What are we to do?' Moody said, 'Pray to God to send us bread.' That night, in the midst of the dead and dying, they held a little prayer meeting, telling the Lord all about the case and begging him to send bread immediately, though from where it could come, they had no remote idea. All night long, they plied their work for mercy. With the first ray of dawn, the sound of an approaching wagon caught their ears. And presently, through the midst of the morning, appeared a great Dutch farm wagon, piled to the very top with loaves of bread. On their asking the driver where he came from and who sent him, he replied, 'When I went to bed last night, I knew the army was gone, and I could not sleep for thinking of the poor fellows who were left behind. Something seemed to say to me, what will those poor fellows eat? It came to me so strong that I waked up my old wife and told her what was the matter. We had only a little bread in the house, and while my wife was making some more, I took my team and went around to all the neighbors, making them get up and give me the bread from their houses, telling them it was for the wounded soldiers. When I got home, my wagon was full, my wife piled her baking to the top, and I started off to bring the bread to the boys, feeling just as if the Lord himself was sending me.'" Here's a sample of one of the tracts that they gave out through the Christian Commission: "Watch and pray lest you enter into temptation," so you know kind of where they're coming from. I'm going to have to zoom on by some of these. This is just, as I was researching, I found dozens of articles on D.L. Moody in the Chicago Tribune during the war. He had no reputation other than the fact that he was the hardest worker. And wherever things that were happening on the benefit of the soldiers was happening, he was in the middle of it, whether it was from the YMCA or the United States Christian Commission, he was there, and so they were often recognizing his work. Here's a sample of one of his passes. To get in and out of the camps, you had to have a pass, and so this is a pass to Murfreesboro, Tennessee, 1863. That's artist's rendering of what it might have been like where he's working on the field. And these are some of the situations that they would come upon where the wounded are just piled up, and there may be doctors left from the Army that was there, and there may not be. And so other people had to pick up the slack. And I'll finish with this story. Maybe I will. Oh, that one's over here. Sorry. During my first year in the Civil War, I visited my Sunday school scholars in Chicago. I went home and heard that a father had been killed in battle. Their mother was the first soldier's widow I had met. She had two little girls, one about 3 years old, another about 5. Days afterwards, the landlord came for the rent. She told him her pitiful story. She didn't know where she could do to get to pay for the rent. She didn't even own a sewing machine, so she must get her living using a needle and didn't know whether she could find work. The landlord told her if she couldn't pay the rent on the first day of the month, she would be turned out, and she began to weep. The oldest little girl wanted comfort. Blessed little ones, they light up our lives and cheer us in our loneliness. The mother, grieving for her loss of her husband and fearing the bleak winter that was coming, gave way. Hope seemed gone. And the little girl said, "Don't cry, Mama. Won't God take care of us? Won't He hear us?" "Yes, my child." "Well, then what makes you cry, Mama? Maybe I can go and ask Him to take care of us." And she went to her room, door ajar. The little one knelt down by their bed, and this was her prayer. "Oh God, you have come and taken away my papa. My mama doesn't have any money to pay the landlord, and he's going to turn us outdoors. We will sit on the doorstep and catch cold and die. Won't you lend us a little house to live in?" Oh, that's your notes. Then she said to her mother, "Mama, don't cry. I'm sure God will hear our prayer." Moody made it known amongst the businessmen in Chicago. A lot was bought, a home was put up, and I think it was the first house put up for a soldier's widow in Chicago. Not long after, she brought her little girls to see me. They had a penny bank and said, "We want to do something for the soldiers. We want you to take this money and buy a Bible and give it to the Army. And find a soldier who's not a Christian and give it to him, and we can pray for him." The father was gone, but the widow and children wanted to pray for someone. I went to the Bible house and got 2 Bibles and took them with me into the Army in front of Richmond, and I stood and told the story. I held up one of the Bibles and said, "If there is a soldier here who's not a Christian who wants to come forward and kneel down and take this Bible, I have the prayers of a widow and those little children in Chicago. Who will come forward?" Pretty soon, it's pretty hard to get a soldier to move in that direction, but they came forward by scores. I gave only 1 Bible that night, and I believe a great many started for the kingdom of God. The next night I was in another part of the Army. I told the story, and the soldiers sprang forward to get a Bible. And the prayers of the children and of a widow. I believe God used this widow and her children to bring a good many into the kingdom of God. Moody ended up late in the war going with the army of Sherman into Richmond, and ended up experiencing that great victory. And Lincoln was also in Richmond at that time, and so he had a tremendous experience during the Civil War, and the opportunities he had to share his faith helped him grow in being able to share his faith. And he actually started then speaking on a regular basis in a church in Chicago, founded his own church, and then became one of the greatest evangelists in the 19th century. Moody Bible Institute is named after him. Moody Church is downtown Chicago. There were 2 or 3 schools in Northfield, Massachusetts, where he grew up, and he preached over a number of million people. I don't know if they know the count, but he had a great experience in sharing his faith. So that's my D.L. Moody presentation. I think there's 1 or 2 books available. I did not write the book. Somebody asked for an autograph. I said I didn't write the book. I just making them available. They're a very good resource, and I have a bibliography in the back if you wanted to find out that book or other books that are helpful in knowing D.L. Moody.